Since the beginning of photography, photographers have known that when someone views a photograph, they're attracted to areas of focus. They're also drawn into areas of brightness. Therefore, since the early days of photography, people have burned and dodged or brightened and darkened their pictures in order to, in a sense, direct how someone views the photograph. And burning and dodging really is an art and a craft. And so in this movie, I want to introduce you to the burn and dodge tools that we have in Photoshop. We'll be working on this photograph of my daughter Annie here with her brand new puppy. Yet before we get to the photograph, I want to show you how these tools work on 2 demo layers so that you actually understand how they work, and then we'll apply what we've learned to the photograph. All right, well, let's turn on the demo layer gray right here. Click into that layer, and then I want you to navigate to the Tools panel, and let's first select the Dodge tool. Now, these tools are named after traditional darkroom techniques, so it may be tricky to remember what tool does what, but here it is. The Dodge tool allows you to brighten. The Burn tool, it allows you to darken. Let's select the Dodge tool first. Now, when you select the tool, you have some options up top here in the options bar. You can choose a brush size, a brush hardness. You can target a different range of tones. We'll talk more about this in just a minute, but this allows us to focus our adjustment on certain tones. We can also dial in our exposure. If we have a brighter exposure, well, then this will work more intensely. If we have a lower exposure, it will be more subtle. Let's start off with the exposure all the way up to 100% because this is just a demo. Here, if I click back and forth in order to paint over this area of this gray layer, we can see that I can brighten that area up pretty quickly. Now, if I decrease the exposure way down to 10% or so, what will happen is as I click back and forth the same way, we can see that it's just barely brightening that up. When you have a lower exposure setting, it allows you to work in more subtle ways. So exposure with this tool is really important. You can change that quickly by tapping a number on the keyboard. Press 5 to go to 50%, 9 to go to 90%, or you can press 2 numbers like 44 and it will go to 44%. In this way, you can quickly modify that exposure as you're working. I should also point out when you're using this tool, often you'll want to use a brush without any hardness so that you can subtly brighten up or darken an area of the photograph. All right, next, let's take a look at the other tool, which is the Burn tool. Here, when we select that, we have the same exact options. And here, I'll go ahead and click and paint back and forth, and we can darken the photograph in this way. All right, well, I know that this isn't very exciting looking at this on a few demo layers, but stick with me. It'll get good in just a minute. All right, well, let's turn off the visibility of this layer. Let's go up to the top layer, which is called Tone. Click on the visibility of that layer. Now, what I want to highlight here is that with either of these tools selected, Dodge or Burn, we have the ability to work on certain tones. If you click on this pull-down menu, you notice that you have shadows, midtones, and highlights. Now, I've created a layer with 3 tones to sort of simulate our darker tones, our midtones, and our highlights. And if we select one of these, let's say shadows, and then crank up the exposure to exaggerate, and click and paint across the image, and here I'll paint a couple of times, you can see that it's primarily working on these darker tones. If I change this to midtones and then again paint across the image, you can see that it's going to have a more pronounced effect on these middle tones here. And then if we move to highlights and click and paint across the image, you can see it isn't touching those darker tones at all, but really it's favoring this side or this tonal region in the photograph. Now, this is a bit of an oversimplification, yet it does highlight how you can use either of these tools in order to target certain areas of your image in order to brighten or darken those. So again, just to highlight this, we can do the same thing by clicking and holding on the Burn tool and selecting the Dodge tool. And if we work on our shadows and click and paint across that, you can see I can brighten up the shadows without brightening up the highlights. Why would that be helpful? Well, it might be helpful if you have a highlight that's already bright enough, but you have a shadow nearby which is too dark. This will allow you to just work on the shadow. All right, well, enough with our demo layers. Let's get to the photograph. Here, we'll click into the background layer and copy it. Press Command-J on a Mac, Control-J on Windows. We'll go ahead and name this new layer Burn and Dodge. Next step, I want to brighten up the puppy right here. So let's click on our tool and let's choose the Dodge tool. Then from the options bar, we want to choose a brush without any hardness. And here I want a nice big brush. I'll try one that's about 200 pixels or maybe even larger. Next, for the exposure setting, typically you want a relatively low exposure so that you can subtly brighten up this area. Remember, the beauty of light is that it moves in really smooth and fluid ways, and so you don't want to have all of a sudden a harsh brightening effect, but you want something subtle. Our range for this area, going to be midtones. So here with this brush, I'll go ahead and just click over the puppy a little bit here, and also Annika's hands, a little bit on our shirt there, just to brighten up that area. And let's take a look at the before and after. Here's before, then now here's after. A few simple adjustments which help us to sort of redirect to also view the puppy. Now we could click on Annika here too and brighten her face up a little bit. And again, now we have two areas of focus, before and then after. What about darkening? It works exactly the same way. Here we'll select our burn tool. With the burn tool, we want to work on midtones, because in this case I'm just going to work on these tones in the background. Drop that exposure down to 50% or less. Make the brush bigger. To do that, we can go into our brush pull-down menu right here, and then I'll just start to paint over this background a little bit. I'm just going to darken up a few of these areas. And by darkening up your edges, what you can do is you can keep the viewer focused in on the subject. Because remember, the eye goes to areas of brightness. If you have an area of brightness right on the edge of your photograph, sometimes the eye can be attracted towards that, and they can be pulled away from the subject. Here, the adjustments that I've made are subtle, yet they help out the photograph. Let's take a look. Here it is before, and now here's the after. And perhaps more important than these adjustments here are that we now know how we can work with these tools. And before I wrap up our conversation about using these burn and dodge tools, I want to share with you one more helpful shortcut. Stick with me because this shortcut is really worth it. Well, currently you can see that I have the tool selected, which is the burn tool. This allows me to darken the photograph. So let's say that I'm darkening part of the image right here, and then I decide, you know what, actually I also want to brighten something up. I want to use the other tool. Well, you can access the other tool with the settings, which you previously used, by holding down the Option key on a Mac, Alt on Windows. Now when I click in Paint, I can brighten this area up, and you can see that I'm brightening up the jacket here in this part of the photograph. In other words, whenever you have one tool selected, and then if you press Option or Alt, it will toggle to the other tool. And whichever you have selected, again, it just allows you to go back and forth between these two. And this is a great shortcut because the reality of burning and dodging is it's something that you do together. You darken a little bit here, you brighten another area here, and this helps you to build the overall visual interest in the photograph. All right, well, that wraps up our conversation about working with the burn and dodge tools. Yet we're going to continue to talk about burning and dodging, and we'll do so in the next movie. In the next few movies, I want to highlight a technique that I use on almost every photograph that I work on in Photoshop. And this is a technique which allows us to do some burning and dodging on a separate layer. What we'll do here is create a new layer, change the blending mode to soft light, and then paint with a dark or a bright tone in order to darken or brighten different parts of our photograph. With this image, what I want to do is darken the sky and brighten up the path. So first, let's create a new layer. Here we'll go ahead and click on the new layer icon, and I'm going to name this new layer Path. Next, what I'm going to do is grab the brush tool, press the B key to select your brush tool. Up here in the options bar, you want to choose a brush without any hardness, and you want to choose a brush size which is appropriate for the task. Here you can see for the path, this brush size might actually work, although I'm going to increase it a little bit more, and then we'll decrease it as we go. Next, when it comes to brightening and darkening, I always like to start with a little bit of a lower opacity. So here we'll bring our opacity slider down. I'll try about 30 or 40% or so. Now, if you want to darken, you'll paint with a darker tone or with black, or if you want to brighten, choose a brighter color or tone. In this case, I'll choose white. Now, before we start painting, what we'll need to do is change our blending mode. Yet I'm not going to do that yet so that you can kind of see the difference. Here, I'll go ahead and paint over this path. Now, right now, this looks a little bit murky at best. Yet when we change the blending mode right here to soft light, what that allows us to do is to brighten up this path in a really nice, clean way. Take a look at how I'm building up the brightening effect in this part of the photograph. Now, if I want to work on the smaller part of the road, I'll tap the left bracket key to make my brush smaller. And I'll go ahead and just paint along the road here. I'm going to make my brush smaller and smaller, getting way back down there to the road because I want to draw the viewer into this area of the photograph. And here I'll just paint some more lines. And all that we're doing is just painting with white in this case, which allows us to brighten up this part of the picture. Take a look. With a few brush strokes, here's before, and then now here's after. And the great thing about doing this on a separate layer is it doesn't take up a lot of file size, We can always undo this, erase it, lower the opacity, whatever. All right, well, let's do another burn and dodge adjustment. This time, though, let's work with a few shortcuts and let's work on the sky. Whenever you're burning and dodging with this technique, what I like to do is create a new layer by pressing Shift-Command-N on a Mac or Shift-Control-N on Windows. Here I'll name this new layer Sky. And I like using this technique because it allows us to choose a soft light blend mode right here. Now, some people prefer to have this soft light layer filled with this neutral 50% gray, yet that step isn't necessary unless you're going to use the burn and dodge tools. In my case, I'm not, so here I'm going to use a brush and just paint with white or black, so I'll leave that option turned off and then click OK in order to create that layer. Now this layer already has the soft light blending mode turned on. Awesome. Next step, choose your brush tool. We want to paint with black, and we need a really big brush. So here I'll press the right bracket key. I'm going to make my brush really big, and I'm going to zoom out as well. Press Command- on a Mac or Control- on Windows to zoom out, and then just paint over this area. And with a big brush, you can work quickly across this part of the photograph. And I wanted to zoom out so that I had really fluid brush strokes across the sky. You want to make sure you're not stopping halfway through your photograph and creating a divot of darkness in one certain area. All right, well, let's zoom back in and see how we're doing. Here's our before. Now here's our after. Well, I actually like what I did to the sky, but I made a mistake down here on the mountains. I darkened those up as well. So no big deal. I'll go ahead and choose my eraser tool, which you can find in the Tools panel. I'll make the brush a little bit bigger by pressing the right bracket key and just paint over this right here. And in this way, I can kind of paint that away. If we paint away too much, no big deal. Just go back to the brush tool, paint with black again. This time, I'll use a little bit of a smaller brush. I think my brush was a bit too big. That's why I had that overlap onto those mountains there. This will give me the ability to be a bit more precise. I'm just going to paint over a few little areas in order to create some visual interest. Next, I'll move over on this side of the photograph. I want to darken up my edges here. I'm going to lower the opacity down to 10%. Sometimes it's nice to work with a really low opacity as you start to build some transition areas because, you don't want even amount of darkness everywhere. That's what makes photographs interesting, is how things are bright or dark in different areas. Again, with a few simple brush strokes, we've improved this image in huge ways. Let's take a look. Here's the sky and some of the outer edges before, and then here's after. And then here's our overall before, and then now here's our after. Now that we know how we can work on a black and white image and burn or dodge using the technique where we create a new layer and change that layer blending mode to soft light and then paint with dark or bright tones, next what I want to do is take a look at how we can use this technique when working with color photographs. We'll start off with a simple example here, and then we'll dig a bit deeper in the next few movies. With this image, what I want to do is darken the edges of the photograph to really draw the viewer into the subject. This is a photograph of a world-famous surfer, and so I want to darken all of these brighter areas again so the focus is a bit more on the subject here. Well, to do that, let's create a new layer. To create a new layer, let's use that shortcut which we've learned. Press Shift-Command-N on a Mac or Shift-Control-N on Windows. This allows us to create a new layer, and to name the layer, we'll go ahead and name this new layer Darken. Next, we'll change the layer blending mode to soft light, and then go ahead and click OK. So again, step one is to create a new layer, change that layer blending mode to soft light. The next step is to select the brush tool. You can press the B key to select that tool, or just click on the brush tool icon. Then you want to choose a dark tone. In this case, we're going to choose black as our foreground color. So go ahead and make that selection. Next, we want to control our opacity. We can change opacity by tapping a number on the keyboard. I'm going to tap the number 3 to take the opacity to 30%. All right, what about the brush? Well, if you right-click or control-click over the image when you have the brush tool selected, it opens up the brush dialog. Here we can choose our brush size. I'm going to start off with a relatively big brush without any hardness, then just click off of the image in order to close that dialog. Next, I want to just start to paint over a few areas, making some pretty big, broad brush strokes here. May need to zoom out a little bit, so I'll do that. Press Command- on a Mac or Control- on Windows. And often it's fun to kind of start with a big brush just to sort of see how you can begin to darken up certain areas. You, of course, need to be careful not to get into those smaller areas too closely. But here with this photograph, because we're really just working on the background, And darkening that, we want to bring more focus or attention to the subject. We can use a really big brush like this. All right, so far so good. Again, just sort of clicking and tapping around the background. Let's take a look at how we've done so far. If we click on the eye icon over here, what we'll see is this is our before, and then click again, you can see the after. And again, all that this is doing is sort of taking that background down a little bit and in creating a bit more drama or visual interest in this photograph. And how far you take this, of course, is completely up to you. Burning and dodging is one of those techniques which is really subjective. And so as you start to work with this, what I recommend you do is experiment with how much you want to darken something up. Also experiment with your overall opacity. Here you can lower your opacity in order to scale this back a little bit. Here's the before and after. In this case, it's a bit more of a subtle look. When it comes to burning and dodging or darkening and brightening, this is entirely subjective. And what you want to make sure that you do is that you use this technique in order to clarify or further your vision for the photograph. You know, my vision for this image is to really focus in on the subject because here we have this top-notch surfer standing on these train tracks. And again, I just want to darken those edges to draw a little bit more focus on him and also create just a touch more drama. Here we have it, our overall before, and then now our after. All right, well, now that we've seen how this works on one color photograph, what I want to do next is build upon what we've learned here and dig quite a bit deeper, and we'll do that in the next movie. Let's continue to talk about how we can burn and dodge our photographs, and here let's build upon what we've already discussed, how we can create a new layer and change that layer blending mode to soft light and then paint in order to brighten or darken our photograph. Well, in this movie, I want to really focus in on working with a color image, and I want to share with you a few techniques which are especially helpful when you have a color photograph. For this project, we'll be creating 3 different layers in order to work on it. Now, this is a picture that I captured in one of my other lynda.com training courses, and this is how the image appeared right out of the camera. Yet what I want to do is modify it a little bit. I'm interested in darkening the background and then brightening up this area of the picture. So to do that, we'll create 3 different layers. Let's create the first layer by pressing Shift-Command-N on a Mac or Shift-Control-N on Windows. And I'll name this new layer Background because this is going to be the layer which will allow me to darken the background. Here we'll change our blending mode to soft light, then click OK. Now when we start to work with color images, we can burn or dodge with black or white, yet we can also burn or dodge with a color that we have in the photograph. Let me show you what I mean. Here, select your brush tool. Next, rather than using black or white here, what I want you to do is to position your cursor over an area where you can sample a good color. Like I want to sample the color of the shadow up here. To do that, hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt on Windows, and then click. Notice that allowed you to temporarily select the eyedropper tool and then sample this color. If we click on the color chip now, we can see that we sampled a nice dark brown. We can even darken that up a little bit more if we want to. Now, of course, you could always select black, yet what I find is when you select black or white, it can change the color of the image a little bit. So sometimes it's nice to burn or dodge with a dark color or with a bright color. In this case, obviously because I want to darken the background, I'll use a nice dark brown, which sort of matches the color palette that we have here. Next, click OK. Then, of course, we want to lower our opacity. So go ahead and decrease the opacity. I'll bring this down to about 30% or so. Then I want to increase my brush size. Here I'll press the right bracket key to do so. Then I'm just going to start to paint. And in painting over this area, because I have the soft light blending mode turned on, it's allowing me to darken this up. I'll just go ahead and paint over on this side as well. We can even get away with painting over some other areas too. Make the brush a little bit smaller as we get closer to the subject, because I want to make sure that I don't darken up the subject at all. And again, just clicking and painting over all this. It's always kind of difficult to talk and to do this at the same time because I'm trying to focus on the task at hand as well as explain what's happening. But I think you get the gist of how we're doing this. Again, just painting across this area. If we click on this, you can see here's the before and then now here's the after. One of the problems with my brush strokes is that they're a little bit choppy. Well, we can smooth that out by navigating to the Filter pull-down menu. Then you choose Blur, then select Gaussian Blur. Whenever you're painting brush strokes with a mouse like I'm doing here, this can really help out to sort of smooth those out. So we'll just increase the radius a little bit, which in turn will make all of my brush strokes much softer. Next, click OK in order to apply that. Well, I want to work on the background even a bit more. This time, though, I'm going to use black to create a bit of a darker look, and also that will help me to sort of remove a little bit of the color. So press Shift-Command-N on a Mac or Shift-Control-N on Windows. We'll name this background-2. Here, we'll use a soft light blending mode. Click OK. This time, we're going to paint with black, and let's lower the opacity even further. I'll go down to about 15%. Make the brush bigger by pressing the right bracket key, and I'm just going to click and paint over this and darken up some of these areas. What I'm trying to do here is build a little drama into this so that the focus is really this beautiful bride here, all dressed up for the big day. So just painting with big, huge brush strokes, a nice soft edge brush. Make sure there isn't any streaking or overly enhanced brush areas. Here we can see this adjustment. Here's before and after. And really, it's these adjustments stacked up together which allow us to come up with this result. Now, whenever you're working with color, let's say that like with this color here, and you realize, you know what, I actually don't like the hue of that color. It's a little bit too red for me. What you can do is something fascinating. You target the layer. So target this middle layer titled background. Then press Command-U on a Mac or Control-U on Windows. Next, you can change the hue. Let me exaggerate this for a moment. I'm going to oversaturate it. Notice how there's a lot of red in that? You can change this hue or change it to a different color using hue saturation here. And this can help us to match the color more effectively. Now, you won't want to oversaturate that color. If anything, you might want to desaturate it a little bit or just shift the color. In my case, I want to make the color a little bit more yellow, so I know if I bring the slider to the right there a little bit, that will help me do that. All right, again, just a subtle adjustment, but it helps out when it comes to burning and dodging with color photographs. Already, our photograph is looking a lot more interesting. Here's the before, and then now here's the after. Also, as you make these adjustments, if you feel like, you know what, I went a little bit too far on this layer, just lower the opacity, just knock that back a little bit. And here we can click into these various layers and take this back in order to have an image with a little bit less drama. With this photograph, I think I like it a little bit darker there, so I'll increase this. It's important to know that you can use those sliders. All right, well, now that we've done all of this, the last thing that I want to do is brighten up this area. To do that, let's create one more layer. You know how to do this already. It's Shift-Command-N on a Mac, Shift-Control-N on Windows, change the blending mode to soft light, and then we'll go ahead and name this one Face, because more or less we'll be working on that area of the photograph. Next, click OK. Now here what I want to do is sample a really bright skin tone. So hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt on Windows with your brush tool selected, and go ahead and click on the skin. Then click on your color chip. That's the foreground color chip there. And what you want to do is just brighten this up a little bit more, and then click OK. Here we'll go ahead and just start to paint over this area of the image. And in doing this, we're just going to brighten up this part of the photograph. I'm brightening it up with a little bit of a color shift in there in order to create kind of this nice, soft, sort of pastel light glow. We could also paint in other areas of the picture too if we wanted to brighten up other parts of our photograph. Here's the before, and then now here's the after. In this case, we also might need to change the color. You can do that by pressing, what's that shortcut? Do you remember it for hue saturation? Pressing Command+U on a Mac, Control+U on Windows. Here we can desaturate that if we want to remove some of the color, or we could also shift this. Again, we could change the color hue there or color tint to that, and then click OK. Now the brightening effect that I have here for this photograph, I think it's nice, but it's a little bit too soft or too pastel-y for my taste, so I'll just scale this one back a little bit. This is a layer that I needed to do that. I just want a little kind of bright snap of color in that area. All right, well that looks pretty good. Yet more importantly than how it looks is the technique. And this is the technique. You create a new layer, change that blending mode to soft light, and then paint with a bright or a dark tone. And that can be black or white, or it can be a tone that has a little bit of color in it. With this image, it helped us to create this particular look. Here's our before, and then now here's our after. And what I like to do at the end of creating this, or the end of my burning and dodging, is I like to organize my layers. So you click in the top layer, hold down the Shift key, click in the bottom layer for our burning and dodging, then press Command-G on a Mac or Control-G on Windows. We'll go ahead and name this Burn and Dodge. The advantage of grouping this together is it helps you to sort of see the image in a finished state. Here I can see the before, now I can see the after, I might decide that I'll just scale this back a little bit and have a little bit less intensity of the overall effect. Again, you can dial this in so that it works well with your own vision. Most importantly, you want to use this technique in order to clarify your vision and your voice for your photographs. Keep in mind, the art and craft of burning and dodging, it's all about directing how the viewer experiences your photograph. So far, we've been talking about how we can burn or dodge or darken or brighten different areas of our photograph, and we focused in on working on larger areas of the picture. Here, I want to shift our attention to something smaller and more specific. In particular, let's look at how we can work with these techniques in order to brighten shadows. I want to brighten up the shadows that we have here underneath the eyes and also underneath the lips. In order to do this, we'll create two different layers. Let's start off by creating the first layer using the new layer shortcut, which is Shift-Command-N on a Mac or Shift-Control-N on Windows. We'll name this new layer Shadows-1, and we'll change the blending mode to Soft Light. Here, go ahead and click OK. Step 1 again, create a new layer, blending mode to Soft Light. Step 2, press the B key to choose your brush tool. Then in the options bar, we want to use a brush without any hardness. We'll want a nice small brush. This one's actually a little bit too big, so I'm going to decrease the size there a little bit. I want to have a nice small brush so that we can just work on these shadows here. Now for opacity, I often like to start with a really low opacity. So I'm going to bring this way down. I'm going to take it down maybe to about 10 or 15%. Next, what about the color? Whenever you're working with skin tone, it can be helpful to sample a color. So here, hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt on Windows, and then sample on one of the brighter skin tones. Click on your color chip, and you could even brighten this up a little bit more if you wanted to. Next, click OK. Well, now that we've done that, we'll go ahead and just start to paint over this area of the image. And here I'm just going to paint back and forth, little teeny brush strokes. You want to be careful to just subtly take away those shadows. Make the brush a little bit smaller, work on some of that more intense shadow area. When you're new to this technique, again, it's really helpful to have a really teeny brush, really low opacity. As you get a little bit more comfortable, we'll crank up that opacity so that you can see how you can start to brighten up these areas. Another thing that will invariably happen when you're using this technique is you'll be asking yourself, am I even making a difference? I mean, do these adjustments even matter? Am I making a difference in the world with what I'm doing with these adjustments? And you know what they do? Eventually what we'll want to do is take a look. Here when we click on the eye icon, we can see here's the before, and then now here's the after. Now the improvements so far are really subtle. We'll need to take those shadows out even further. Yet again, you want to think about taking them out in stages. Again, it's just clicking and painting over those areas. Change your brush size. Work on some of the smaller shadows and move around the image. If you've ever done woodwork or if you've ever sanded wood, you know that you can't sand it all at once. Rather, you have to go through the process of little by little sanding away all of the problem areas. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So again, we'll just go ahead and work on those areas. If we discover that the color or the skin tone doesn't match up, well, we can fix that. Do you remember how we can apply a hue saturation adjustment to a layer? You press Command-U on a Mac or Control-U on Windows. Here we can click and drag this in order to choose different colors. And what you want to do is look for a color which really matches the overall skin tone. In this case, I'm going to add a little bit of a hue shift and also a bit of a desaturation so that this blends in. Again, I'm going to try to find just the right color there so that it looks really natural. I think that looks good. And then click OK. Now here we have the before, and then now we have the after. Okay, well that's step 1. Well, step 2 is going to be to create another adjustment layer, just like this, and here we're going to continue the process. Yet before we actually finish up this layer, I'm noticing that my brush strokes are a little bit rough. So here I want to illustrate something. I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to go ahead and paint with black, and again, this is just an illustration. I'll go ahead and paint a black line over the top of the image, and I'll make this really harsh and strong. What you can do is navigate to your filter and choose blur and then Gaussian blur. And when you increase this Gaussian blur slider, notice how it's just softening out that brush stroke until it almost disappears. And in this way, we can really customize how soft we want that edge of that brush to be. So here, I'll go ahead and click Cancel. I'm going to delete this layer, and I want to apply some Gaussian blur to my brush strokes on my Shadows 1 layer. Navigate to the filter, choose blur, then Gaussian blur. What you want to do is just keep an eye on the area that you've worked on. In this case, it's probably just going to be a pixel or two just to soften those edges up a little bit. You can also click into your preview and move it around and evaluate your preview there as well. All right, well here, I'll click OK in order to apply that. I think that looks pretty good. Let's create a new layer. Press Shift-Command-N on a Mac, Shift-Control-N on Windows. We'll name this new layer Shadows-2. Blending mode this time is going to Soft Light. Click OK. Now because we have a little bit of color work already there, I'm just going to paint with white. And sometimes white or black will work well. Rather than 100% opacity, I'll take this down to about 20 or 30%. And then we'll go ahead and just paint over these shadow areas. And again, as you paint over them, you want to make sure that your image still looks natural. What's amazing about this technique too is that by working with shadows in this way, it'll help you to start to see shadows differently. Sometimes after you look at the results, you'll say, I can't even believe the way that this image looked before I actually started to work on it. And I can't believe I didn't really notice those shadows that much. And so again, it's one of those techniques which can help you to see little areas that you might want to work on now that you know this way to work on them. Well, again, I'm making just little progress here. I have a few areas where I'm not liking my brush strokes. Like over here, it's almost like I went a bit too far. So I'll grab the eraser tool and I'll make my brush much smaller and I'll lower the opacity because we can erase at low opacity as well. I'm just going to erase away what I've done there. And then I'll grab my brush tool, it's a little bit bigger brush. And you know what the problem is there? The problem is my opacity is too high. So I'll drop my opacity down. And again, we all encounter issues like that as we work on these parts, these shadows. They're delicate little areas. All right, well, let's look. Here's before, and then now here's after. And so again, I think so far so good. That's looking all right. Couple little fix-up areas I need to do, so I'll use the eraser tool in that area there. Then we'll go to our filter pull-down menu, choose blur, and then Gaussian blur. I kind of like to think of Gaussian blur as the poor man's Wacom tablet. You know, Wacom tablet allows you to paint with pressure sensitivity. And if you don't have that, like right now I'm using a mouse, well, you can use Gaussian blur to create softer edges, and this can help out, especially when you're trying to paint in light, as we're doing here. Well, here I'll lower the opacity on this layer a little bit more. I feel like that was just a bit too bright, and then we can see the overall results. Here's the original image, and again, often we think, gosh, I can't believe I didn't notice those shadows more clearly. Then here was step 1, and then step 2, and then the overall before and after, where we've really worked on those shadow areas of the photograph and improved this overall portrait. And as you make these improvements, keep in mind what you want to do is maintain the person's character and personality. You always want to be careful not to go too far. I find that I tend to do that. That's why lowering this opacity here on this layer can really help out. It can sort of lessen the overall effect so it looks a little bit more realistic and natural, yet you still benefit from this. All right, well, there you have it, a great technique which allows you to work on shadows, and all that this technique involves is creating a new layer, changing the blending mode to soft light, and then a lot of patience and painting all of those brush strokes slowly in order to improve your photograph using this technique. In this movie, I want to share with you a burning and dodging technique, which is especially helpful when you want to work on a larger area of your photograph. Like with this image, I want to darken the sky. In order to do that, we'll take 3 steps. We'll create an adjustment layer, which will fill the entire image with black. We'll change that layer blending mode to soft light, and then we'll use a gradient mask in order to gradiate how this adjustment will affect our image. Let me show you how this works. Here, click on the adjustment layer icon and then choose solid color. The color that we're interested in is this deep black way down here, so go ahead and click on that. Then click OK. Obviously, this black layer is covering up everything, yet when we change our blending mode by clicking on the blending mode pull-down menu, what we'll see is we'll simply apply a darkening effect. Here's the before, and then here's the after. The next step is to select the gradient tool. Actually, before you do that, make sure that you have black and white as your foreground and background colors. Here we'll choose white as our foreground, black as our background. Then select the gradient tool by pressing the G key or selecting the tool. And if you have white as your foreground, black as your background, it will give you a gradient which goes from white to black. Next step, click into the mask. Now what we want to do is we want to conceal this adjustment in this lower area. We could, of course, use a brush and paint over that area, yet when you have a large area, like sky in this photograph, the gradient tool works incredibly well. What you'll want to do is click and drag, and when you click and drag across your image, what you'll discover is that it will allow you to limit where this adjustment is being applied. You can click and drag a little bit longer in order to extend it more, or click and drag shorter in order to bring it up. And where you stop that drag, that will then stop the transition or stop that effect in that area. Here I'll just go ahead and click and drag through the image. We can then see the before and now the after, and it looks a lot better. Now we can further customize this by clicking into the mask, grab your brush tool, and then paint with white or black. Here I'm going to choose black because I notice it also darkened the car, which I don't really like. So I'll bring my opacity up a little bit, press the left bracket key to make my brush smaller. I'm just going to paint away the darkening effect in this area. Because typically in your photographs you won't have an exact gradient throughout the entire image, so you may need to fix this up a little bit as well. Or if you want to remove this from the mountains, you could just paint over those too. You can also paint in this effect into the other areas. Here, let's choose white. Remember, white reveals? If I paint on my mask with white, it will reveal the darkening effect. Rather than 60% opacity, I want to reveal it way down to 10%. Make the brush bigger, press the right bracket key to do so. I'm just going to darken up these rocks a little bit here in the foreground. And here in this way, we're kind of combining a couple of different techniques together. We're creating a gradient, and then we're hand painting on our mask in order to darken certain areas. Here you can see the before, and then now you can see the after. And in this case, we use this particular adjustment layer, which allowed us to darken the image. You could create other adjustment layers as well. This could, of course, be a curves adjustment layer or a levels adjustment layer, and then we could use a gradient mask in the same exact way. So it isn't necessarily particular to this type of adjustment layer, yet the technique of using the gradient adjustment on the mask, well, that's where this technique really comes alive, especially when you have to work on a larger area in your photograph.